I'm doing but I don't think they have training because it's not on the
And so when I go there,
I left Jaffe.
oh, I take these.
Well, no, it's okay. I was trying to
They would teach out.
Oh, I'm trying to get you.
You want that?
I was reading that 16.
Yeah. So he's coming right now. Yeah. We met on election night. And no, like Hirsch.
We might be ready. Oh, okay, sure.
There.
We put it on my right here.
Well, you're gonna be sitting here, correct?
Yeah.
So you're not gonna be facing me.
Oh, I see, I got you. Yeah.
Also, did you see that I was used to use a Logitech web?
Yes, I zoomed in.
I think that
Yeah, I know.
Yeah, I heard it. I heard portions of it. I was driving.
How are you?
Is he?
Yeah. Yeah.
Was it around?
Yeah, you know, fun things like that.
I can barely write my name. You know, and it's, respect and
This is your cable here? You want to tape it down, or you comfortable like that?
You're comfortable. Yeah, close the door.
I'm good, you know. Never gonna roll that. The only question is, I'm gonna try to You said your name is Hunter? Yes. In relation to Nick? Only blessing and a curse. We're all blessing.
It's okay.
I'm ready when you are. Hello.
I'm going to ask people to take their seats. We're going to begin.
Just somebody's back. Yes.
Please take your seats. We're about to begin. Please take your seats.
Testing, testing. If you can hear me in the back, raise your hand. Thank you. Okay, good morning.
Morning.
I'd like to welcome you all to the Murphy Institute. This forum is sponsored by the New Labor Forum, which is a journal that comes out of our institute. It has chronicled the events and issues in the labor movement for nearly 3 decades. If you're in this room and you're not a subscriber, you're a criminal. Please subscribe. It really is probably one of the best of its type in the entire country. You'll hear this one, the New Labor Forum, but the Joseph F. Mercy Institute has a Center for Worker Education, where we run degree, certificate, and workforce development programs tailored to the needs of working adults and focused on the issues of concerns for the working class people at affordable CUNY tuition rates. If you're interested in electoral politics, for example, you might want to check out our graduate or undergraduate certificate, public administration, and public policy programs. Information about this and all of our programs is available on the rack located outside the back door, or you can speak to one of the Murphy staff. Where's Eve? There she is. Stand up. If you have questions today, you can grab her after the event or any of our other staff. Thank you. Mama Didn't Raise Any Stupid Children. This is a book called New Labor in New York, Precarious Workers and the Future of the Labor Movement, edited by Professor Ruth Milken and myself. Buy a copy, baby needs new shoes.
That's a very good book. I'll simplify.
I'm going to briefly introduce our panel. This is a panel that many of the people in this room are familiar with, but for those of you who are not, I'd first like to introduce Juan Gonzalez. He has been a staff columnist at the Daily News since 1987 and co-hosts Democracy Now!, which you should all be supporting, where he was earlier this morning. He is a 2-time recipient of the George Polk Award for Commentary in 1998 and 2010, and the first reporter to consistently expose the health effects arising from September 11, 2001 attacks and the cover-up of these hazards by government officials. He is a founder and past president of the National Association of Hispanic Journalists, where he created a project to improve coverage of the Latino community and recruit and retain Latino journalists. A founding member of the Young Lords Party in the 1970s and the National Congress for Puerto Rican Rights in the 1980s. Gonzalez has received Lifetime Achievement Awards from the Hispanic Heritage Foundation, the National Council of La Raza, and the National Puerto Rican Coalition. He has written 4 books, but the most recent one is most recently with Joseph Torres, News for All the People, the epic story of race and the American media. He is also a member of the editorial board of New Labor Forum, which you should all be subscribing to. Sarah Jaffe is an independent journalist whose work has appeared on the Washington Post, the Atlantic, the Nation, the Guardian, In These Times, and many other publications. She is co-host of Dissent Magazine, the Labor podcast, a bi-weekly look at where the labor movement has been and is going, and since earlier this year, the author of a regular column in New Labor Forum called Under the Radar, which uncovers hidden and neglected news items regarding workers and their organizations. She is currently at work on a book about social movements since the financial crisis, which is scheduled to be published in 2016 by Nation Books. Errol Lewis is political anchor at New York One TV and host of the station's Inside City Hall nightly program and New York City Politics. Prior to joining New York One, he was a columnist for the New York Daily News, where he also served on the editorial board. Formerly an associate editor of the New York Sun, Lewis is a CNN contributor and frequently appears on Dobbs Tonight. Once named by New York Magazine as one of the 10 New Yorkers making a difference with energy, vision, and independent thinking. In 2010, the Village Voice named him the city's best newspaper columnist and radio show host. Michael Hirsch, my longtime friend. Michael Hirsch is a New York-based labor and politics writer whose work has appeared in the New Statesman, Crane's New York Business, Village Voice, Labor Notes, and other venues. A former steelworker and sociologist, he has been the editor of 2 city union papers and most recently retired after 13 years as a staff writer for the United Federation of Teachers. He also writes regularly for The Independent And last but not least is the author of an article on last week's dismal elections and where to go from here, which will be appearing in the New Labor Forum, which you should all be subscribed to. I'm going to begin by telling the audience that Mike has a bad throat today, so if he gives out, it's not because he's choking, but he's choking. I'm going to ask the panelists to open up with 3 minutes or so on what their strong impressions of this election were and what they think the most important things are coming out of it. I'm going to start with Juan.
I think the most important thing to take away from what happened a couple of weeks ago is that people only come out to vote when they have some real reason and are energized to do so. And so I think we had nationwide, I think it was like the lowest turnout of eligible voters since the 1940s, since 42 or 44. And so clearly there was an electorate that was grossly disenchanted with government in general, and clearly the electoral map made it even more difficult for Democrats. I think in 2 years, the Republicans in the Senate are going to have the same problem. As 33 more seats come up for re-election, and 23 of them will be Republican seats, and only 10 of them Democratic seats. So I think that I'm not as disheartened by the initial results as some people are. I think that those of you who haven't seen it or to read Bill de Blasio's analysis of the election in the Huffington Post, I didn't think with all the problems that de Blasio had, he had enough time to do a thorough analysis of the entire national landscape. It's pretty good for a for a mayor. So I definitely recommend it to read it. But he takes a very similar tack that those Democrats who fled progressive politics didn't do as well as those who embraced progressive politics in the recent election. I also think that the main issues of 2016 have already been enunciated by President Obama in the last week. He's already made 3 major decisions which are uncharacteristic of him, and also set the stage for what the major debates will be over the next few years. And those 3 issues are immigration, net neutrality, and climate change. He has already indicated that all 3 of these, he's taking a much more bold position than he has in the past, but obviously he has nothing to lose at this stage, and that he is, I think, more oriented in terms of what his legacy will be and what the battle will be in 2016. And each of these has really created a furor, not only among the Republicans, but also in corporate America. The decision to try to use whatever executive authority he has to commit the United States to more aggressive reduction of greenhouse gas emissions. His challenge to his own SEC commissioner on net neutrality, and saying that you've got to have the strongest possible protections of the internet, and his soon to be announced executive order on immigration. These are going to be he's already set the agenda in the first week. And I think that these are going to be the major the major issues that will be battled over in the next few weeks and months, but also will force all of the other senators, congressmen, and most important future presidential hopefuls to take a stand on these major issues. So I think that I was surprised by how quickly he came out of the gate with these issues and this insistence that he's going to use whatever powers he has as president to force national debates and national action on these issues. So generally speaking, I'm hopeful. I also think that we in New York City are in a unique situation. I've said this repeatedly now throughout most of this year, that we currently have the most progressive local government in the history of the city. And not just with the mayor, but with the city council, with the public advocate. Never has New York City seen a government so much geared toward progressive politics. And so much so that it's really, the knives have now come out in the last few weeks, and it's going to increase the attacks on the de Blasio administration, on the city council, because as the financial community and the real estate community realizes that this administration is not backing down on any of its major promises, but is actually trying to implement as many of them as it can, they're seeking to try to do whatever they can to put the brakes on.
So I'm with Juan, I'm hopeful. The reason that I'm hopeful, I want to add one issue to the list that you just gave, which is also that the Obama administration is looking into getting rid of student loan servicers, who are the bane of my existence and probably of at least some people's existence in this room, and doing that directly, which would be huge. So that's good. I'm also hopeful because every time you put the minimum wage on the ballot, 2 weeks ago, people voted it in huge percentages, 60%, 67%. Paid sick days on the ballot, almost 70% of voters turn out for this. In Alaska, the voters overturned a measure that would have taken collective bargaining rights away from public employees. Once again, we're seeing that when you put the issues very clearly in front of people, they vote the way we would like them to. The depressing part about that is that those same people came out and voted for keeping Scott Walker in office. But what we see here, and I think the point that Juan started out with is really worth underscoring here, is that a lot of people didn't come out to vote at all. I also want to bring up that in a lot of states there were new repressive voter restriction laws that in some places, there was an article on Al Jazeera that actually tracked the margin of victory in some of these places where, these were admittedly sort of mediocre Democrats, but in either case, the margin of victory was less than the amount of people who were affected by these new laws. And so we're talking a depressed turnout clearly because people weren't motivated. We're also talking a depressed turnout because people have done their darndest to pass laws to make sure that we have a depressed turnout. And that's a thing I think we're really going to have to look at going into 2016, going into local elections next year. That this is going to continue to be a pattern because once we put our issues on the ballot, when we have a clear choice here, people do actually tend to make the right one. When you have Mark Pryor in Arkansas refusing to vote for a federal minimum wage increase, voters can be forgiven for coming out 60% to vote for raising Arkansas's minimum wage and not voting for Mark Pryor.
If you're still hearing me, I blame Mayor Cuomo. And I do so because I did enough screaming at the Working Families Party convention to justify my throat going out of whack for 3 months. So if I can't continue speaking, I'll give Eddie notes and he will read them to the degree he can read my handwriting. I'm hopeful. I'm always hopeful. If I wasn't hopeful, I'd kill myself. There's always a possibility. We always talk about the long view of history. I'm particularly hopeful because of what I saw in California. My wife Lila and I did a tour. And one of the places we went to was Richmond. Seabury has written about this. Barry Commons spoke. 500 people came. The meeting was sponsored by the Richmond Progressive Alliance. They've been working for 10 years to establish themselves. They won the election, and they won the election over the opposition of Chevron, the main employer in the town. Chevron put up $3 million to get rid of them. Didn't work. People on our side now run a small town in California, and I believe it can be a model for the kind of municipal reform that can lead to other things. In terms of the election itself, what disturbed me was how little labor issues are reflected in any of the dialogue. President Trump then said, pretty much what Sarah said, that when working people have a stark choice, they will take that stark choice and will make a rational choice. So the same people who voted for increasing the minimum wage also voted for some of the worst politicians in the country. What I'd like to find out, and maybe something that perhaps people in the audience will contribute, where was labor in being sure that some politicians somewhere were carrying their banner? This was an election in which the Republicans attacked the president, and the Democrats said, we can live with this because they'll eventually implode, and then we will take over. The issues that this group stands for were not reflected at all in this election. I've never been more disgusted with the Democrats than this election. I also want to say something about the working family point. I don't begrudge the unions who are affiliated with the party for making a self-interested decision that they would be powerless if they blocked Cuomo. What I do fault them for is coming to the Working Families Party and saying, anything over Cuomo, or we're gone. It seemed to me that they could have said, and I'm talking about my nine, talking about the Mason tenants, they could have said, listen, we know you don't want to endorse Cuomo, we've got to endorse Cuomo. We'll agree to disagree, and we'll get together, and we will get together again in November. That didn't happen. I came away thoroughly disgusted. That's what happened to me here. That's why I'm going to Cuomo. And I don't, as long as I've been around the politics, I do not understand why the Working Family Party had been strong on to endorse perhaps the most conservative governor to government. I'll stop there.
Thanks. Errol.
My sense of one thing I don't think we should lose sight of is there was a certain amount of just technical incompetence when it came to running some of the campaigns, both at the state level and nationally. There's just no excuse for some of what went on, where some of the memos are now starting to come to light about the Wendy Davis campaign in Texas. They just didn't get it together, and it's got to be mentioned because the consultants absorb millions of dollars. You know, people write checks in good faith, expecting it to be put to some use on the ground, and a lot of it simply gets wasted. There were also some very cynical tactics that went on. I'm sure some of you, like me, were so bombarded with so many emails that purported to be coming from the vice president or the first lady or the former Speaker of the House, Nancy Pelosi, and they would write these things in such a way that you couldn't ignore the subject line, and it was just one more fundraising appeal. And they did it so much, even though, you know, as a journalist, I have to keep up with this stuff. I had to take myself off some of the lists. I mean, I just couldn't get 20 emails a day and open them up. And, you know, because they're saying, you know, Errol, I really need to talk to you. I'm like, oh, at last, Nancy Pelosi knows who I am. Only to be disappointed one more time. And in some ways, that's sort of a metaphor, I think, of what happened to a certain extent. There was a strange ambivalence and some strategic missteps that I think led to disaster. I watched Alison Lundigan Grimes in the one televised debate that she had with Mitch McConnell, and that very embarrassing situation in which she wouldn't just simply say, of course I voted for the president, I was his delegate. My father was the chair of the state Democratic Party. You know, a reasonable adult could put one and one together, and yet she simply wouldn't do it. And it turns off voters. I mean, there's just no question about it. You've got to sort of be clear with people and not resort to sort of cynical trickery. And so at the same time as so many of the national Democrats, and I don't think saying that, well, the map wasn't favorable is really an excuse. I mean, if you run against the president in Arkansas, the head of your party, you lose. That's one lesson from the Mark Pryor loss. If you run away from the head of your party in North Carolina, you lose after spending, close to $100 million in that race. So that was a strategically bad decision that was executed poorly in many cases. At the state level, you found, in a strange way, I thought sort of the opposite. I know there's a lot of discussion about this now. People are calling it Monday morning quarterbacking, but that's what we were doing here. And I think it was a mistake to put de Blasio front and center in some of these suburban and upstate swing and conservative districts. It enraged the opposition. It brought the opposition out. It wasn't really. I just don't think it was a smart idea. And there's a difference between a good idea that happens not to work and a bad idea. That would be a bad idea even if it succeeded. This, I think, was a bad idea. That it would have been a bad idea even if it succeeded. I say that probably because I grew up in the suburbs. There was literature coming out in some of these state senate districts that are now Republican, where they said the only reason you need to come out and vote is to stop Bill de Blasio and his gang of progressives from New York City from taking over control of the state because they want to get citizenship well, not even citizenship. They want to get illegal aliens, their literature said that, the right to vote and get them all on food stamps. I mean, it was crazy over the top stuff, and they campaigned on it, and they won based on it. And I think that was foreseeable. I think they could have guessed that would have been at least part of the response. And if they didn't, there's a fundamental misunderstanding of how state politics works. That the progressives were going to encounter this demonization of everything that they stand for, and that if you don't have sort of time and patience and people on the ground to explain what it is you really stand for, you're going to get caricatured, which is what happened. And I guess finally, two things. One is, what was missing, I think, at both the national level, especially at the national level, was really actively harnessing the electoral campaign to social movements that are currently on the ground and in the streets, right? I do not know for the life of me why this question comes up all the time. This is not anything new. This has come up every decade, every presidential election. You've got the movement activists and you've got the electoral politicians. How do we get some kind of conversation, dialogue, mutual alliance, something going on? But you've got Occupy that was out there. You've got this incredibly potent movement that popped up around Ferguson, groups like Color of Change. You've got all of this activity on the living wage. I mean, they're the only ones who compete with, frankly, the Democratic fundraisers as far as the number of emails. People who are marching at McDonald's in every corner of the country. There's all this stuff going on. We just had the climate change march, all of that stuff, and I didn't see any kind of coherent effort to even have a dialogue with those folks, much less try to maybe sort of work with some of their issues. Then there's very practical, tactical stuff about what kind of email lists are we willing to share, what kind of conversation and mutual policy development are we willing to get engaged in. And that's going to continue to be a question in the future. And then I guess I'd say finally, while I'm starting to get patient enough to realize the wheel turns, things change, life didn't come to an end in 1980 when I first cast my first vote, which was, in the Ronald Reagan election. Things change. They start one way, they end up another way. But there is a disturbing possibility that I think we should all take a look at, which is that in so many of these state houses where they're captured by one party, there's a possibility that states can change the electoral college for their state. So that instead of the very familiar winner-take-all scenario that we all know about, if you win New York, you get all 29 votes. If you win Florida, you get all of their votes. They can change at the state level so that it's kind of by congressional district. It's done right now in Nebraska, where, you can sort of, 2 votes go one way, 1 vote goes the other way. If you look at it carefully, in some of these states where Republicans have control of both houses of the legislature plus the governor's mansion, they may decide to sort of carve up the electoral vote according to these gerrymandered districts that already help them sort of win a lot of victories, and that could really change things quite a lot in 2016. So that's something to keep an eye on, and we can learn to live with a lot of different things. That's one, I think, along with some of what was mentioned around basic voting rights, state to state, that we should not be willing to live with, and people should really be on the alert for.
I should just remind everybody, tell everybody that this is actually being live streamed on the Murphy Institute blog, which is something else you should all be paying attention to and feeding into. And I was reminded I did not introduce myself. I'm Ed Ott, and I went back here in labor studies. I guess nobody told the mayor about Ed Koch's trip north of the Bronx border. And he literally got his head handed to him. So somebody on de Blasio's staff, I guess they were all too young to remember that moment. But I want to come back. Both, all of you, in one form or another, talked about this low turnout. And in New York City, particularly, it goes back to the last mayoral. And a lot has been made of that vis-a-vis the Democratic Party. Errol, you talked a lot about tactics. Sarah, you talked a lot more optimistically, actually, that there were reasons that people did go to the polls. But why didn't they go to the polls? They certainly had reasons in this election, and it's not unique to the city. It goes across the country. And later on, I'm going to ask you all about Illinois. But I just thought you'd talk a little bit more about why you think this diminished turnout is taking place.
Do you want to start with you?
Yeah, start with you.
Andrew Cuomo. Did anybody in this room get excited about going to vote for Andrew Cuomo, even if we held our noses and did it, maybe? No!
But it went back to the mayor.
I can't really talk about as much, but I mean, this election, of course nobody voted for Andrew Cuomo. I mean, partly mayoral elections, I don't know, I haven't been in New York long enough to actually track these numbers over a 10-year period, or a 20-year period. But yeah, partly also though, I would say that and especially, and this is where I tout you all to read the book that I haven't written yet, that I think the financial crisis is something very, very strong in people in this country, which is that this system is not working for us. And this is a bipartisan feeling or a nonpartisan feeling. And it has led people to think that why bother voting? We're getting screwed anyway. These people are not actually going to pay attention to my issues. And this is a feeling that you have that I can get on the phone with my Republican dad in South Carolina, and we both sort of throw up our hands and go, none of these people care about what I care about. None of these people are talking about the fact that the so-called recovery is only a recovery for the billionaires who are buying those new apartments along Central Park. And it's not a recovery for the people who live in my neighborhood in Crown Heights who are being gentrified out, largely by people who look like me, who are also now being pushed out. There's a huge disconnect. Even when we were talking about these issues that we're somewhat hopeful about, the real facts of people's lives are that, I heard this the other day, that 2 in 40 jobs or something like that created since the financial crisis have been full-time salaried positions, and the rest of them are part-time contingent work, or you're driving a car for Uber and doing TaskRabbit on the side. And if we don't actually get some politicians who talk about this, and not only talk about it, but talk about it in a way that actually convinces people that they're going to do something about it, what do? And then finally, I think with Bill de Blasio, one of the things that's interesting is that the successes that the city council is able to have are the ones that they bring something up a little bit on the bottom end. They've had almost no success other than refusing JP Morgan a city handout to build a new building in actually challenging the people who have all the money and power. And that I think we need to also be real about, that until somebody gets out there like FDR and says, I relish their hatred, and means it in terms of being willing to give up those campaign donations, again, people have no reason to come out and vote, and they have no reason to believe that these people are going to do anything for them.
What can I say? This, first of all, to begin with, everything of our electoral system is structured to prevent full participation. And I mean, I just take the example, I was born in Puerto Rico. In Puerto Rico, 80% turnout is low in an election. 80% is low. I don't think there's ever been 80% turnout in this country, at least not since the days of Jackson and John Quincy Adams, and then that was only white super vote at that time. But basically, so why is that so? Well, first of all, in Puerto Rico, election day is a holiday. It's not only a holiday, but everything's closed. Movie theaters, restaurants, everything is closed. And the election is only once every 4 years for everything. In Puerto Rico, the political parties buy airtime on the radio stations on election day, and they start reading the names in the local radio stations of all the people who have not yet voted. So you're listening to the radio and you hear, oh, your cousin hasn't voted. Oh, hey, I just heard on the radio you haven't voted. So there is an enormous pressure on the population to vote in this country, because one person votes is a dangerous thing to those in power. Our whole system of elections has been to dampen voter participation. And it's been my theory that the mass media rose specifically to be able to affect that one person, one vote, because the mass circulation newspaper rose right around the same time in the 1830s as working men and women, working men were getting the right to vote. And so I think that the mass media plays an enormous part in dampening participation. Why? Because they only concentrate on the big races. What drives participation are the local races. If you have a party that has not only the person at the top, but the local person at the bottom who's actually organizing people to come out and vote in their district. So I think that the issue is that there's a structural situation with our system that's geared not to have a participation, because it's always the working folks and the poorest of the population that vote the least. So obviously any increase in participation is going to change the nature of the election. That said, the mayoral election had a problem as well, because we haven't had a major participation in a mayoral election in this city since the two Dinkins-Giuliani races. Those were the ones that really brought out enormous participation. All the others have been on the way down, and this one is part of that same process. Because there are no more political parties on the ground, it's all television ads. Television ad may influence how you think, but it's not going to get you out to vote on election day. An organization is going to get you out to vote on election day, and those really pretty much don't exist anymore in any significant way. So I think that the organizational structures to pull people out to vote have disintegrated and given way to the media, and the structure of the system itself is geared to keeping working people and poor people from voting.
You know, years ago, and I'm going to try to get into the labor movement a little bit, and then we're going to draw the audience earlier. So after this round of comments, I'll be taking some questions. But years ago, Norman Adler, when Victor Gottbaum was running District Council 37, made the point when Gottbaum was trying to take over the Central Labor Council that the Democratic Party in New York as a citywide political entity didn't exist, and that the labor movement really has the potential to be the only citywide, neighborhood by neighborhood political operation in the city. And I mean, frankly, I was there for a long time. We never lived up to that potential. And I was just, you know, where was labor in this last round? And I don't just mean this election, but going back to the Obama 08, there was enormous participation, enormous commitment and energy. We put hundreds of millions of dollars into this arena. What's in the buyback? Mike, I'm going to let you jump in early before your voice kisses goodbye.
Let me go back to participation. Remember, Europe has the same problem. It's not as extensive as it is in the United States, but the rates are going down in Europe. There's a wonderful new book that Virgil put out by Peter Mayer called The Hollowing Out of Democracy. And his argument is not so much that people are disenchanted, which they are, and not so much that they don't have a tradition of voting, which they do, but that the parties don't function the way they once functioned. That what's been hollowed out is the party. So the party doesn't become a vehicle for anything but gelling candidates. It can't mobilize people. In the United States, you can't be a member of a party. You can be a member of a club, but not a party. Saying that, I think that the other reason that, to answer any question, why was there no big vote here the way there was for Mayor Dinkins, has to do with social movement. More to the point, it has to do with the fact that we've had a Democratic president, 6 years, who's been terrible. People know that. What to vote for? They don't think they're getting close to the party. They think the president is a crock. They will laud him as an individual, but they won't come out to vote. That's my explanation.
I remember shortly after the inauguration of Obama, there was this issue of card check. And was card check going to be a big national issue that both the Democratic National Party and the president were going to get behind? And I remember Ed Schultz was talking about it almost daily on the radio, and it was kind of a big deal. And as I recall, there was a decision, and I think Labor accepted that decision, that the Democratic establishment was going to walk away from that issue. That in the context of everything else they were going to try and get done, in particular healthcare, that's right, they didn't want to sort of throw that into the mix.
Well, let me just jump in on that, because the truth of the matter is, during that run-up to that election, both Hillary and President Obama were still in the race. The labor movement asked then candidate Obama about the Employee Free Choice Act and the card check. And he was very clear, and I think I heard it differently than some others, but what he said was, if you can pass it, I'll sign it. Now, everybody in New York State who trains anybody in labor and politics, and we do that here, by the way, usually, knows that when a politician says to you, if it comes before me, I'll vote for it, they're against it. That is the language. Basically what he said to them, and after I had this conversation with Patrick Gaspar, who's now worked at the White House at the time that the card check was on the floor, and he was very clear. He said, look, the only place the president is hearing about this issue is in union halls, nowhere else.
And what's wrong with that?
Well, because what he said was, labor, and the message was very clear to us, you guys don't have the power to do this. Well, if you remember, the first bill the president acts on is a wage bill, right? It's the Ledbetter Act, which for pay equality, and we were not in an alliance with them on that and card check. So just from that point of view, I want to get back to this labor move. Does labor have the power that it thinks it does, even in a place like New York State?
I mean, my sense of it is that, and I was kind of there and was working as an organizer at the time when they put the Working Families Party together, and it was right. No, there were a lot of meetings. There was a lot of hope. There was a lot of doors knocked on. There were, I remember speeches by Dinkins and some other people, and it was sort of a hopeful time. This was in 1998, and what it has turned into is really something considerably different from what that vision was. But in any event, I don't know if it was ever clear whether or not there were going to be a series of political clubs. What complicates everything in New York is that we have this strange thing where third parties basically don't have much clout unless they're harnessed to the main party. So in some ways you're just deferring the question. You're really back to the same question you're asking, which is that, can you do through labor and through labor affiliated institutions, including the Working Families Party, can you do the business that the Democratic Party cannot or will not do on a citywide and even at a district level? The results have not been encouraging, honestly. There are too many incentives if what you're going to do is harness it to winning a particular race. And this is true whether you're talking about a statewide race or for assembly or anything else. There are too many incentives, there are too many corners that can be cut. You find somebody and say, oh, well, fundraising would be a big chore for the right candidate. This is not quite the right candidate, but this person has money. So let's just check them off, Or you talk to the organizers and they say, we knocked on, we shook every tree we could in this particular district and we could not find a good candidate, so we're going to go with this guy, and the results are, like I said, not encouraging.
Sir.
I was just gonna say, I'm so old that I remember when the Working Families Party didn't endorse anybody in the New York City mayoral primary because the unions couldn't agree on who to endorse. So I mean, if we want to talk about labor having power, labor has to actually work and play nice with others. And I mean others within the labor movement, not just like others outside and reaching out to others, which I've seen a lot of encouraging signs for. But literally, if we want to have something that is labor's power in New York City, then they actually have to be able to agree. And I'm a journalist who just covers this stuff, right? I don't actually have the power to make that happen. But it seems to me that like part of the problem is that labor's been busy fighting with labor, within labor, over labor. Mike, I know you have.
There's a perfect example of that, the fight over fracking. At the AFL-CIO convention, it was almost a floor fight. It got finessed at the last minute. The head of the, not the ILA, I'm sorry, the head of the, oh my God, that's why I don't do public speaking. One of the key unions, the laborers, thank you, the laborers. The head of the laborers basically said, why are you two guys taking a stand on this? You're killing jobs from our members. And we've always agreed in the union movement that we don't piss on each other. He said in so many words. And this is outrageous. This was at the same convention that the AFL-CIO was planning to have joint work with the Sierra Club. It already had joint work with the Blue-Green Caucus. Yeah, labor is terribly divided amongst itself. We know in New York City, construction trades support one type of construction, and the community groups support another. And to get them on the same page will be very, very difficult. I just want to say one thing about the last election. I believe that the Clinton second run was much smaller than the first run. I think it had lots to do with the fact that the Democrats were in power, the Democrats were disappointing, the base didn't come out. It's the same thing happening in Europe. The left believes it can only accomplish anything when labor's in power, but it can only win an election when the conservatives are in power. So,
let's open it up a little bit. Please, right here. Stand up, you're going to get your mic.
Hi, my name is Marty Rosenblatt. I'm a long-time labor person. Yes. I just want to post something, and that is, there is not one Democratic Party. There are different parts of the Democratic Party. There are the Blue Dog Democrats, there are more progressive Democrats. So therefore, when you see no responses to some of our wishes and needs throughout the country, they're not the same. Some are hunters, some are not hunters. In New York City and elsewhere, the labor movement is often tied to the same corporate interests that are visible. For example, I was on the city's pension funds for about 45 years, and I saw how the money gets invested. If you examine some of the pension funds that you're talking about, like 1199, Hotel Trades Council, and other major organizations, you would be shocked at how much of their money goes into the same real estate projects that people want built here. And in addition to that, the very point that you made, we have the same thing in many local communities. 32BJ wants jobs in the buildings that are going to be built. The Hotel Trades Council also wants jobs there. 1199, they want jobs there. And they're often opposed to the community. Therefore, some of these labor groups are so tied to the financial interests that the public doesn't see anyone responding to them. There's no voice, even inside the Democratic Party, of which there are different factions. We need something new to be built in the country, a voice that represents the voiceless. And then you have an opportunity to move forward.
Yeah, if I can just respond to that. I was talking about before about the president net neutrality. Where's the CWA on net neutrality? Ask yourself that. You know, the 1199 has always been known as a progressive union, but 1199 and the hospital industry of this city, you can't tell them apart anymore in terms of the interests that they have and what they push. So that we do have a problem with within the labor movement of, unfortunately, the leaders so identifying with their own industry and the needs of their own industry that they forget the needs of the population in general. And if that problem can't be solved within the labor movement, and to hold the labor leaders accountable, because I think it will be like totally a betrayal for the CWA to not take a stand in support of net neutrality, of recognizing the internet as a public utility.
Right.
And if it does so, the leadership will show that it's basically in bed with the telecom companies.
Yeah, it's been very interesting. I hope some of the union folks that are out here will get up and talk about some of the thinking behind their electoral work at the current moment, why they went in the directions that they did. I see some of you out there. Go ahead, please.
Hi, Bruce Rosen. I became what's called a fractivist several years ago because I attended a state hearing and I heard a petroleum geologist with 30 years plus experience in the industry speak against his source of his good income, saying this is an industry that lies, that defies and destroys all regulation, and there's no way New York was unprotected. So jumping from that, because that's symptomatic of what we're facing, the elections in Kentucky were brought up. No one was telling the actual story. They were making up this story about coal miners. Less than 1% of the workforce there is in the industry. The multiplier effect brings it up to less than 5%. The state of Kentucky spends more money than it takes in to provide the infrastructure, and geometrically more for health care, for the effects for miners and everybody else around from the industry. But that wasn't on there. So there's a complete breakdown on messaging, or what's really education of voters, of union members and the like. And I'm wondering how that ever gets responded to.
Well, that's a tough one. I mean, look, on so many issues, and frankly, the issue's not much less complicated in New York. Honestly, you know, I mean, you go to there's a Tioga County in Pennsylvania, and then right on the other side of it is a Tioga County in New York, and a tale of two Tioga counties. You know, one, there's high wages and happy union members, and on the other there's relative desolation and a local population that's very resentful, by the way, of downstate fractivists, saying, you know, well, who are you to tell me what I'm supposed to do with my property, my family's future, my community's future, which is frankly kind of a good point. Ideally, there'd be some kind of political entrepreneur, we call them politicians, or political party that would at least have some kind of conversation, or, you know, create some kind of a conversation. Ideally, there'd be a media. I've been trying to get up there, but I'm not in a position to just go anywhere I want, and get some facts established, get some conversation going. And you know, we're very far from that. I mean, just as a backdrop to what happened in New York State, and we shouldn't, you know, I mean, I mentioned the state Senate before. We shouldn't downplay the fact that New York had more seats flipped from Democratic to Republican than any other state. We had 3 seats flipped, and it was nearly 4.
If Republicans wanted to challenge David Cuomo, they could have.
Look, I was at the Republican convention, the state convention. We were doing coverage of it, and the thing that came across most clearly was the level of cultural. They felt disinherited. They felt, you know, disenfranchised. You know, the Republican Party in New York State, at least the way they presented themselves at their state convention, was a party of small towns and rural communities that are suffering, that are struggling, and that are not being heard. And, you know, that, I think, was the engine that drove a lot of their voters to the polls in this last election.
It would be interesting to see, actually, if some of those small town Republicans on the fracking issue come into clash with their national party's desire to drive this energy question and where it goes. Sarah?
Oh, I was just going to say, right, the fact that the Republican Party is painting itself as the populist party is like, we are really bad at this. But yeah, the labor movement, and one of the reasons that I've been fascinated with the fast food campaign, the Walmart campaign, all of these things is because they're actually pushing issues in a way that makes labor look like a class interest, right? It makes it look like the labor movement is looking out for people who are working in crappy jobs. And it's not, because it's not about getting those people signed up to be members of SEIU or members of the UFCW, but it's about talking about low wages and talking about unpredictable scheduling and talking about what it's like to be a single mom who works 2 low-wage jobs. It's actually bringing people to a point where polls in this country now are, people's view of unions is up in the last few years. People are more favorably disposed to labor unions than they have been. And I think that that's what we need to think about when we start to talk about the narrow interest of like, we need these fracking jobs, or we need whatever these are. We separate ourselves, first of all, to just what you were talking about, and then also we lose those people who are in these upstate rural counties who, like, they should be on our side because they, and I'm not talking about the Democratic Party, I'm talking about the people in this room, which is a very different thing, I think.
All the way in the back, Larry Moskowitz.
Yeah, just 2 things. The first is follow up on what Ms. Jaffe just said. I think that while it's easy to make, and they're not wrong, criticisms or specifics within the labor movement, you have to understand that the challenge is to balance jobs for the members with the social issues. And I think the movement is much, much more towards thinking that through and doing the social movement part of it. I just want to remind people that over 80 labor organizations endorsed the climate change march. Just a month ago, I was the labor coordinator for that. And, you know, resource-wise, backbone, the Eric Garner demonstrations in Staten Island. And, you know, there's a long list. And I think that when we discuss the labor movement, it's not to be Pollyannish about the weaknesses, but, you know, to pass through all that, but to see where the process is going. The second thing is to start with Errol, but for everyone. You know, it's incompetent campaigns, but the question is, where do you draw the line between incompetent campaigns and incompetent politics? Because just to take one example, look at the Dominant Recchia campaign here in New York. He didn't get the numbers, or he got just about the same numbers that we got for Frank Barbaro, who only spent a few $100,000 and had really no name recognition going in. And the question is going from the general to the specific, not just to make that observation, but then if you are a progressive, if you are a labor union, when this is what the Democratic Party does, right, put up someone like this, politically as well as organizationally, what are your choices? What do you do? I mean, I don't want to give you speak.
Let's give the panel a chance to respond.
My favorite thing about that race was the article in the Times where literally the people that they talked to who were trying to choose between Dominic Recchia and Michael Graham are going, is there a socialist on the ballot I can vote for? Staten Island! We have huge opportunities.
We did a story on Hank Bardell, the Green Party candidate, in there, who, you know, I mean, he's campaigning out of his house with no staff, and you know, didn't raise even $1 for the campaign. But we were thinking, well, if it's close, maybe he'll sort of be a deciding factor. You know, that race is a perfect example of all the things we're talking about. The Democratic Party put up Dominic Recchia, in part because there was sort of, they cleared the field for him, in part because they knew he had money and could raise money. And, you know, if you're Steve Israel and you're trying to manage a looming disaster nationally, you can say to yourself, okay, this guy, at least I don't have to raise money for him. And he's running against somebody who's got a criminal indictment against him. He could probably pull it off. And I don't know if their analysis went much deeper than that. That's right. You know, and that, you know, that arguably is incompetent politics. I mean, Juan mentioned before, I mean, when you have active political clubs, and what's strange is that Dominic comes out of one of the few remaining, the mighty Thomas Jefferson Democrats, which meets every Thursday. I'm sure they met last night. They meet every week. They help people with jobs. They have, you know, they have a really cohesive kind of club of the old model. And one of the things that clubs like that are supposed to do is assess candidates, recruit candidates, and know when a candidate has certain strengths and certain weaknesses. And somehow that led them to Dominic Recchia. And just to be clear, you know, all joking aside, and he had some very embarrassing moments on the campaign trail, but we went and looked back at like the last 10 elections in that district, and the Democrat always comes in because they have a registration advantage at it. The Democrat usually comes in the low 40% range, even if they do absolutely nothing. Even if they have absolutely no money, even if they have very little name recognition. And that's pretty much where he ended up.
Yeah, one of the horrible things about that district is, and when I was the political director at Central Labor Council, it drove us wild. It's the highest union density congressional district in the city.
In the country.
And, well, there's some guys in LA. And, you know, we always tell the AFL-CIO to come in and say, oh, we got to go after them. That should be a priority. We would say, you know, you're not old enough to remember Vietnam, but that looks like Cambodia, and on the map it looked really easy.
A couple of inches, right?
The truth of the matter is, it says a lot. I think it goes back to Moskowitz's point in the back. There seems to be a disconnect between Democratic Party politics and the Democratic Party base, and frankly, the same can be said for many of the unions. It does. Staten Island constantly calls into question whether or not the unions actually have a vote in the city sufficient enough that they can deliver. And it's kind of like that broken tooth that you just can't stop rubbing. The other side of it is we have huge municipal unions in this city with hundreds of thousands of members. What's their potential going forward here? Where do we go?
Let me say something about Recchia. It's a fair question, but I'm not prepared at this moment to respond to it. I knew Recchia wouldn't win. How did I know? He's from Brooklyn. Staten Islanders will not vote for a candidate from Brooklyn unless the candidate is absolutely wonderful and has a history of doing things in Staten Island. One of the reasons that Staten Island is so insular is exactly as Ed said. There's a feeling that the city doesn't care about us. We're not really part of the city. And as long as the dump was operating, and remember how long it took them to close that bloody thing. As long as the dump was there, it was like a festering store. We're different. We're the only thing that has a big goddamn dump. It smells. Our property values go down. It's not a place to live. It's not a place to encourage people to come to. And they want a candidate from Brooklyn.
Oddly enough, when Freddie Ferrer runs for mayor, the political alliance that he was able to carve out was between the Bronx and Staten Island, and a lot of it was over the Bronx felt like everybody wants to dump their stuff here.
That's right.
And it was a very similar kind of dynamic. And had that coalition won, I would argue the city's politics would have been very different for a long time. Please. I'm going to make you run. This is Dave Unger, a member of our staff. He's the youngest guy, so we gave him the mic.
Jennifer Fauché from the Public Employees Federation. I'm a lobbyist with them. It was interesting, this whole election cycle, as to how our union got involved with the election process this year. We endorsed Zephyr Teach Out, and that was a very interesting thing because it just happened. You know, we knew, and I think the entire 54,000 member union knew that they could not go with the incumbent. We had been beaten up, we had been laid off, we have had everything happen, there was no place to go. And of course the Working Families Party did find this candidate who was a formidable candidate. And we ran with it, And at our board, we had a very significant margin in support of endorsement, and we did it. And we got troops out. We were the only state union that did it. But we did not see any other state union endorse the incumbent. That was interesting. It was also interesting to look at election primary night to see just where those votes came in for Zephyr Teachout. Those votes, all of the upstate counties, everything around the Albany area, Rensselaer, all of these areas, folks were looking for an alternative vote. The status quo was not acceptable. And it came out loud and clear. It makes you wonder, what if the Working Families Party continued and they didn't drop the ball? Would we have been able to get that nomination? If people really could. She started out with $8,000 and a great campaign manager, Mike Boland. I mean, he got press. He went around to the smaller counties around the state and did what he needed to do. So it's just to say that sometimes you've got to really step out of your comfort zone to make something happen. And I think when Labor does that, we'll be able to see some real change.
But I'm curious that you would, because of all the criticisms of Cuomo, which are totally appropriate, you guys got screwed. The URT got screwed. With all of that, why did you go for the reactionary? You could have voted a protest vote for the Greens. I voted for the Greens the first time I ever did that. I didn't want to, but it was a protest vote. And as a result, they got 200,000 votes. Fair number of protests.
I'm going to go several questions. All right. 1, 2, Errol, and then 3 over there. Go ahead, Errol.
Real quick. I was surprised that one of the key issues for labor nationally never made it onto the agenda, given the demographics of the labor movement, and that is pensions. And all over the country, pensions are under attack, and not only are they under attack, the allocations, talking to your issue, have really been geared not for the benefit of the beneficiaries, but the allocations have largely been for the benefit of Wall Street, which is to say they look at the fees. How come the labor movement didn't even raise the issue? Didn't appear in anybody's campaign literature nationwide. They just didn't see it. I mean, how do these things get on the agenda?
Okay, let me take the second one and the third. Merrill back there. Stand up, Merrill.
Hi, I'm Errol from West Strategies. I guess I wanted to ask, there's a lot of discussion out there about the growing libertarian sentiment among young people and voters, and I wanted to know how you thought that affected the elections and whether how the left can work with that in the future. The second question is, de Blasio gets elected without a big mass movement, and now we don't have a movement to hold him accountable and to craft an agenda to force him to implement. So is there any discussion about the labor movement and social movement and how we can do that so that, we can take advantage of the possibilities?
On the end here.
Hi, my name is Richard Barr. I was involved in the state senate primary, and I want to ask about the state senate. There was widespread skepticism, and rightfully so, when Cuomo supposedly promised Bill de Blasio and working families that he would work for a Democratic majority, and when Jeff Klein and the RDC promised that they'd go back the caucus seat with the Democrats. But I found it amazing, going back 2 years to when Klein and his group made their self-serving, opportunistic move, that there was no pushback that I could see from Andrea Stewart Cousins and Mike Gianaris and the rest of the Democrats in the Senate, or the local county Democratic organizations, why weren't they trying to put the screws on them? And so when finally this election came along and Oliver Coppell decided to challenge Klein and John Lew to challenge Avella, I'd been a press secretary to Oliver in the Attorney General's office. He asked me to help him with this. I was very happy to, because I thought this needed to happen. And the Queens Democratic organization seemed to react appropriately. The county committee, the elected leaders in Queens supported Lew. In the Bronx, they were all not only for Klein, but strongly for Klein, including the people that had been, longtime friends of Coppell. Where was Brooklyn when Simplefelder came into the Senate and immediately started caucusing with the Republicans? Why didn't people there say that either he agreed to come back or they would primary him? Nobody even tried in Staten Island or the two upstate Davids. So it's, I just found that the Democrats were so weak in trying to push back and deal with this perfidy.
What? Well, I'll try to respond to a couple of those questions. One on the pension issue. I don't think, first of all, you're not hearing as much about, trying to eliminate pensions as you did at one point, because obviously, the stock market has rebounded, the pension funds are in a little better shape than they were, and so it's kind of hard for the politicians to keep arguing that there's this enormous hole in government. However, I would counsel leaders of the labor movement against making pensions a major plank of your movement, because the reality is the vast majority of Americans don't have pensions and are not sympathetic to continuing to either increase or protect pensions. So I think that the pensions are absolutely important, but the bigger battle is over Social Security. That's the issue that all Americans have a concern about, and I think that it's the pensions are not a winning or continuing to push pension reform is not a winning strategy in terms from the perspective, I think, of the labor movement. On the issue that somebody said that Bill de Blasio, there was no mass movement that gave rise to de Blasio, I would completely disagree. In fact, I think that the reason de Blasio was able to be elected was that he skillfully was able to use several mass movements and to identify with several mass movements in the city. Number one being Occupy. The whole thrust of his campaign was the Occupy theme of the 99%. Number two was the enormously important but largely underreported education, parent, student movement against charter schools and against continuing to close public schools and defund public education. Number three was the living wage and sick leave movement that had been developing. All of these movements sort of came under, and then of course the stop and frisk and the movement for civil rights. He basically became the spokesman for all of these movements, and that's why he was able to get the support that he did and actually win. That said, I've always said this, I didn't vote for Bill de Blasio. I voted for John Lew. Because I thought he was the most progressive of all the candidates. But that said, de Blasio skillfully was able to bring together all of those movements to come to power.
So I do agree that pensions are a sort of a fraught topic for the labor movement to be campaigning on, but I would also say that they did become an issue in at least one election. There was a great piece that Fred Plonsky wrote in these times saying, I didn't vote for Pat Quinn because he's trying to destroy my pension. And what happened in Illinois was that this, completely repugnant, really, really rich guy won the election because, who's going to come out and vote for the Democrat that literally just took money out of your pocket?
That's right.
Once again. So you know, yeah, these things that got ignored by candidates, or that, you know, once again, Democrats had been instrumental in trying to destroy. Talking about Andrew Cuomo wants to bust the monopoly of public schools. They become issues whether the Democrats like it or not. And yeah, people vote on what got taken out of their pocket, or in that case, don't vote. Yeah, in terms of Bill de Blasio certainly used these mass movements, but there is a much bigger question of, right, how do we hold him accountable, and how do we then press for the things that we need, and particularly the things that we need that there's going to be massive, massive opposition to, which I think has been mentioned several times here, that, you know, finance, REBNY don't want any of these things that people are calling for, whether it's, you know, inclusionary zoning and public housing, to anything that takes money out of the pockets of Wall Street.
Well, I think Juan is exactly right. And I watched that campaign last year very, very closely, week after week. And Bill de Blasio did benefit from and draw upon the energy of these various different movements. But I think Meryl's point is well taken. When you hear the word progressive dropped on the steps of City Hall at the latest press conference, it almost feels like there should be like a trademark after it, you know, where people are sort of saying whatever it is they find to be in their political interest that day. Well, that's progressive, and it's backed by the movement and ratified by the voters and all of this kind of stuff. And it even came up in the whole question of whether or not to have the WFP support Andrew Cuomo. I mean, you know, Bill de Blasio came in and sort of brokered the deal at the end and pronounced it progressive. And it's said in a way that is almost supposed to end the conversation. And so I think people would be well advised to ask questions about accountability and ask about, you know, who put that on the agenda and declared it progressive, you know, and where's the conversation where if we want to maybe modify what you think the progressive direction is, how do you do it?
We saw this, you know, when President Obama gets elected, one of the things that happens in Washington is that the labor movement is paralyzed, and that they actually don't know how to act. Are we supposed to go down to the White House and be supportive? Are we supposed to pressure him? And they've kind of frozen place in that crucial first year, not knowing how to act. And, you know, for us, and the question we've been posing around Murphy in this discussion, partially because of Mayor de Blasio, how does the progressive movement put positive pressure on a liberal government without turning them into the enemy? Some of us were there when we were going through the same kind of questions with the Dinkins administration, which was hopeful to so many people in the city, and yet so limited in its ability and its scope to change the city in the ways that people wanted it to happen very quickly. That Giuliani ends up sneaking in the back door on the second round with some social forces and some movements absolutely angry at the mayor enough to diminish the vote. We lose votes raw votes in the second round in Central Harlem. I'll never forget being at the Central Labor Council at 5 o'clock and getting a call from the dearly departed friend Bill Lynch saying, go to the C lists. And it was David's father, Nick Unger, comes running into the office and saying, we're dead. If we're going to the C lists, we're dead. There's not enough of a vote. And that is a broad question that we need to struggle with. All right, David, you got a couple of people with hands up in the back over there, please.
Hi, my name is Tony. I'm a student with Murphy Institute and also a union member and a doorman. 4:30 to be here, but I have a question. Gentlemen mentioned about incompetent campaigns and incompetent candidates. I think we could deter that by not endorsing incompetent leadership. And my question is, why doesn't labor itself, instead of endorsing, because I kind of studied the practice of endorsing, which is I relate to signing a check, whereas fostering leadership through the membership, why doesn't labor look towards their inner source of memberships and fostering that leadership that is needed in communities, community boards, from the ground up? Why do we continue to endorse and fall into this practice of looking from the outside versus the power of members that have it inside? And will this actually have any effect, can have an effect towards political structures? Because as I think Mr. Gonzalez mentioned, there is some structural constraints within the political movement, and if our leadership gets hemorrhaged within those structures, I think there's a problem. And another thing, when you mentioned labor movement, I wanted to be clear that if you talk about the labor leadership, it's very different from talking to members. I'm a member. I speak, I have a voice not because the contract gives me that voice, because I have a voice, because I know I have a voice. And that's the one problem that we need to also bring up to the table. When you mention labor leadership, you're not talking to the members. And you need to go back and talk to the members. And I guess that also gets lost in translation where the leadership presents their agenda, and the members need to also be there for that kind of conversation. And I just want to bring that out there because I think also, if there's a critique about the labor movement and the democratic and everything else that's put on the table, talk to the members first. I'm a member, I have a voice. I don't need nobody to speak for me. Okay? Thank you.
Who else you have back there?
Hi, my name is Russell. I'm a student at City College. I wanted to ask if any of the panelists would comment on the Howie Hawkins campaign. You started to a little bit, Mr. Hirsch, but just to comment on, leading up to it, there was a lot of sort of like, oh, should progressives vote for the Working Families Party? Should they vote for the Green Party? What does it mean? And sort of comment on the debate that happened prior to the election, and then look at the results. What can we conclude?
This was the first election, to my knowledge, where the Greens actually ran candidates that you want to be governor, lieutenant governor. I've known Howie Hawkins for years. I've debated him because I don't fundamentally support independent political action. That means staying out of the Democratic Party on principle. I think he's a terrific organizer. I think he's really smart. I wish he was the governor. And the problem with the Greens is they don't exist between elections. And the problem with the Democrats increasingly, they don't exist.